We are happy to share the highlights of our study. We are a committee of 10 league members from throughout the state. We began looking at the impact of the decline of local news on Washington 2 years ago, starting as an affinity study group. Then in June 2021, delegates to the state convention approved our proposal for a statewide study. And on November 14th, the state board approved the study. So the next step is for local leagues to address the consensus questions early this year. With that in mind, we'd like to share with you what we've learned. In Washington, newspaper circulation is down 43% since 2004. The state has lost 20% of its newspapers, and the decline of local newsroom staffing means diminished coverage that has left communities without vital information. This decline has negative consequences. Robust local news, from government coverage to public health information, helps provide the glue that holds communities together. Reduced local news coverage results in fewer people voting and running for office. They are less plugged into their communities, and political polarization grows. Accurate public health information is just harder to obtain, and government costs more when elected officials don't have reporters looking over their shoulders. The situation in Washington mirrors what is happening nationwide. The United States has lost a quarter of our local newspapers since the start of the decline. If a community has no newspaper at all, it's known as a news desert. Those are the communities in red on this map. The communities in yellow have only one newspaper. If this trend continues, we could lose 1 in every 3 newspapers by 2025. Yet 70% of people aren't aware of this decline. Let's pause right here and explain to you how we define a newspaper. We recognize that more people prefer to read news online, and that more news organizations are cutting back on print publication. We consider a newspaper any publication, whether in print, online, or a combination of the two, that provides continuing, comprehensive, and accountable reporting of a community's people, government agencies, schools, and activities. This quote here is from the editor of the Spokane Spokesman Review, and it explains this thinking very nicely. Which brings us to the question, why study local newspapers and not TV or radio? Local TV news just does not provide the same in-depth day-to-day reporting of city and county councils, school boards, just like newspapers do. In fact, stations often use the information that the newspaper gathered as a basis for their story. We reviewed all weekly and daily newspapers in Washington, comparing those published in 2004 with those that are published right now. We noted which ones closed or stopped publishing in print, and whether they had new owners or circulation changes. For example, King County lost 11 newspapers, and Snohomish County lost 9. We also looked at how many newspapers were produced in each county. We learned Washington has 13 counties out of 39 where only a single newspaper is produced. Ashoden County has no newspaper, though it gets some coverage from a paper across the state line in Idaho. While many newspapers have closed, others continue to publish, but in a much reduced form. Here's a look at 4 newspapers in Washington. Note that while page counts have declined, the cost of buying a paper has increased for all of them. In Tacoma, the News Tribune publishes nearly 2/3 fewer pages, but charges double for them. In Bellingham and Ellensburg, fewer than half the number of pages, but twice the cost. And in Spokane, more than 25 fewer pages, but a price that's 1/3 more. Papers that continue to publish but have very little content of substance are known as ghost newspapers. One example is the News Tribune in Tacoma. It once was a highly regarded paper that was purchased by a hedge fund during a bankruptcy sale. The hedge fund, Chatham Asset Management, bought 5 other Washington newspapers, 4 of which have also seen reduced circulation and staffing. The experience in Tacoma gives us a picture of how the decline has resulted in dramatically uneven coverage in communities. Tacoma is the 3rd most populous city in the state, with nearly 250,000 people. Yakima is considerably smaller, with a population of fewer than 100,000, but the newsroom staffs are nearly identical in size. Think about that. How does such a small news staff cover a community that is more than double in size? We were particularly interested in how the decline has affected government coverage. In some states, more reporters are covering state government now, but not Washington, where the news staff has been cut by more than half. Here's a photo of the Capitol Bureau in Olympia 2 decades ago. 16 full and part-time journalists. Today, we have only 5 full-time journalists assigned by established news outlets in Olympia. This quote from Paul Query, the AP's former state editor, describes the situation. It's not just at the state level that government agencies and officials aren't getting enough coverage. Throughout the state, newspapers don't have the staff to continue covering scores and scores of city councils, county commissions, special districts, and school districts. The Seattle Times and Everett Herald eliminated their outlying news bureaus, which severely curtailed and in some cases eliminated suburban government coverage. Reporting and editing are labor intensive. Despite reports about artificial intelligence that can report and write, not many people anticipate it replacing human journalists. So job losses directly equate to less coverage of communities. Compared to the nation as a whole, Washington has experienced larger staffing declines, 67% versus 50%. Not long ago, no one initially filed to run for mayor in Gig Harbor, which lost local news coverage until the nonprofit online paper Gig Harbor Now came on the scene. Likewise, in Bellingham, where the Bellingham Herald has reduced its coverage, incumbents had no opponents in several races a few years ago. So we are not surprised when we read a study that looked at 11 communities in California. It found that mayoral races were closer and had more candidates in communities where newspapers had more reporters and editors. Washington State University professor Travis Rideout says less information leads to people to lose interest in their government. There's also a link between local newspaper declines and voter turnout. The Seattle Times looked at voter turnout in the 2021 general election. In Yakima County, turnout was an abysmal 32%, the second worst among Washington's 39 counties. And in Franklin County, where the Tri-City Herald slashed its newsroom, turnout was just 29%. We did a study of our own, reviewing turnout in February special elections in every county in Washington. We reasoned that turnout in an election for a school or fire bond or levy might measure civic involvement more accurately than the turnout in a heavily publicized election. In all but one of Washington's 39 counties, voter turnout decreased from 2008 to 2021. In some counties, the decrease was significant, nearly 13% in Asotin County and more than 11% in Benton County. For example, no newspaper is published in Asotin County, although the area is again served by the Lewiston Tribune. When we looked at the impact of the decline on civic engagement, we found a great resource pretty close to home. Portland State University professor Lee Shaker focused on the closure of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer's print edition in 2009. Using data from the US Census, He defined measures of civic engagement. Shaker said that after the 146-year-old Post-Intelligencer stopped printing, he tracked declines in two areas: in people demonstrating their political or social values by buying or boycotting services or products, and in participation in community groups and organizations. Shaker said a ghost newspaper can be more problematic than no newspaper because seeing a newspaper makes people think they'll be informed about things, such as problems with their drinking water. National studies connect the dots between local newspaper declines and greater political partisanship. Washington State University professor Benjamin Shores says that's because national coverage is conflict-driven, while local coverage is more community-driven. If you don't have a local newspaper, there's really no place where you can write a civil letter to the editor. So people more often repost memes about national political figures. Local media is a major source of information about disease outbreaks, both for readers and public health officials. Officials rely on newspapers to alert residents to what's happening in their communities and to inform them about how to maintain and improve their well-being. At the same time, public health officials rely on local newspapers to track people's activities and behaviors. In Kittitas County, the public health officer learned about a potentially dangerous situation: an indoor memorial service for an elderly couple in the middle of the COVID pandemic. When Dr. Mark Larson read about the upcoming event, he was able to contact the organizers and recommend preventative actions to keep people safer. All of the public health officials we talked to warned about the dangers of people relying on social media for their health information. When newspapers close, it costs more to run local government. Without reporters watching local officials, government tends to expand with more employees and higher wages, increased community deficits, and higher tax revenues. That results in higher borrowing costs for cities and counties. Building a hospital or school can cost as much as 11% more after a newspaper closes. That exact cost can mean hundreds of thousands of dollars of additional interest at taxpayers' expense. And if you ask State Treasurer Mike Pelliciotti, he believes journalists' role as public watchdogs is paramount. Attorney General Bob Ferguson is concerned about how the local news decline affects government accountability and oversight. He read a news story about Motel 6 in Arizona sharing guest information with federal immigration officers, and then he wondered if the same thing was happening in Washington. He launched a civil rights and consumer protection investigation that led to a $12 million settlement. Ferguson has led an effort among other state attorneys general to support federal legislation for tax credits for local news. There are many causes for the decline. Newspaper advertising revenue has fallen dramatically as advertisers have discovered how much less expensive online advertising can be. Once 80% of the Spokesman Review's revenue came from advertising. Today, the paper receives only about 35% of its revenue from advertising. And subscriptions, which have also declined, just don't bring in enough to cover the costs. Big tech has been a major player in this trend. In a Commerce report, US Senator Maria Cantwell accused large platforms that post links to local news stories, such as Google and Facebook, of being unfair and deceptive and engaging in abusive practices. These two platforms account for 75% of the digital advertising revenue in local markets. In the wake of the decline, people's reliance on social media as a news source has skyrocketed. The report takes a look at this, taking care to discuss the problems social media generates, including its lack of oversight and the frequency of it being a significant source of mis and disinformation. One Twitter study by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology indicated that false news on that platform is on average about 70% more likely to be retweeted than information that faithfully reports actual events. We also report on the benefits of social media and how in some locations it is the primary vehicle for distributing information people really need. That's the case in Kittitas County, where more people subscribe to a community Facebook page than to the local newspaper, the Ellensburg Daily Record. For their part, newspapers were slow to adopt readers' growing preferences for online. Many have failed to provide in-depth reporting on major issues, and readers complain that their local newspaper is just expensive, boring, and too political. However, the future is not necessarily all doom and gloom. Legislation has been introduced at the federal and state level that offers a variety of proposed remedies. Some of these state laws have passed and are making a real difference. More and more nonprofit news operations are starting up with financing from grants and readers, and support remains strong for newspapers that serve communities of color. And some communities are stepping up to raise funds for their local newspapers. With regard to the legislative solutions, here are some that have been proposed. Washington legislators this year will consider a small B&O tax credit for newspaper publishers that we've had since 2009. The proposal didn't get out of committee last year after the sponsor said people on both sides of the aisle were opposed. Opponents of the bill have questioned whether government has a role in supporting private business, but many companies benefit from government support. Washington aerospace manufacturers have received preferential tax rate reductions that total more than $90 million. Other aerospace companies receive tax credits totaling nearly $100 million. Nonprofit news organizations in Washington, including Gig Harbor Now and the Jolt in Olympia, are doing a thorough job covering local government. These 8 nonprofits in our state are all either online only or a hybrid of print and online. And it's also evident that local readers have helped keep afloat newspapers that serve communities of color in Washington. And an increasing number of papers are turning to their communities for tax-deductible support. For example, the Columbian in Southwest Washington has raised more than $1 million to hire 3 full-time reporters. The Seattle Times has paid for 27 positions. The Seattle Times has paid for 27 positions in its 120-person newsroom through community giving. But not all of these efforts have been successful. So the question remains, are these few bright spots sustainable? In fact, there are serious doubts as to whether these strategies will sustain the increasing fragile local news business. We're here to tell you, it's not a journalism problem, it's a democracy problem. Historians point to long support for newspapers, even before we became a nation. Our founders established protections for the press in the US Constitution, and we already have postal subsidies for news publications, along with government-financed public television and radio, and legal protections for the press. And we all need to remember what Thomas Jefferson said: a government without newspapers, or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. For this work, we conducted more than 50 interviews and consulted more than 500 reports, articles, and studies. We also created distinct sections, the main narrative and another section we titled A Deeper Dive, where we feature more comprehensive stories about single topics.